folks. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am very happy to have on the show an old friend. We go back to the heydays of the Integral Institute together, back 2006, 2007. And he is someone who I and many regard as one of the very most smartest people in all of Integral land. Welcome, Sean Esbjorn-Hargens.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited to see where we go.
Yeah, me too. So let me, before we get into the topic, just tell my listeners a little bit about you. I know many know you and know of you for sure. But in addition to anchoring many of our Integral Institute seminars, Sean went on to produce 4 very influential integral theory conferences in California with 500 plus people. I went to a couple of them, very impressive. And you know, the karma of those conferences just continues to move through the cosmos. Yeah. You've gone on to found your company, MetaIntegral, which is a leadership and consulting company that works to apply integrative principles to organizations. Yeah. You've written a number of books, the most recent being Metatheory for the 21st Century. Yeah. And you are now in Edinburgh, Scotland, right?
Yeah, I've been here 1 month. It's been blue skies and very cold.
Oh, nice. I loved Edinburgh. And you have the family and there for 6 months.
Yeah, my wife and my daughters, we've been on a year-long European gap year, kind of traveling around, but spending most of our time in Ireland and now Scotland.
Yeah, cool. Well, you're living an adventuresome life in many ways, Sean.
I know, it keeps unfolding in ways that I would never have predicted.
Yeah, me too. And the reason we're actually talking here is that I received an email from you. It was an email you were promoting your new organization that you founded called the Institute of Exo-Studies, which caught my eye. Yeah. And I clicked on it. And it turns out that you are launching this institute, and your initial invitation is to what you're calling the Exo-Studies Master's Course, which starts in September. Yeah. Subhead, Exploring the Psychological, Sociological, and Scientific Implications of Living in a Multidimensional Multiverse, which kept me clicking.
Yeah, it doesn't get more integral than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then I got inside, I got what you're really talking about here. And because I think you let your hair down a little and you build it as an integral UFO ET geek coming out party.
Right.
And I love that. And I just want to read a paragraph that you wrote that just sort of introduces yourself and the topic, because it really touched me. So you say, "This is the course I've wanted to teach for years, and finally I'm going to do it," with 3 exclamation points. "For over a decade, I've been a closeted UFO ET geek," ET being extraterrestrial, "reading hundreds of books and watching thousands of hours of videos, interviews, documentaries, movies, all in an attempt to make sense of my own experiences and intuitions around this fascinating and confusing topic. If there is ever a place where multiple perspectives run amok, bumping into each other and generally creating chaos, it is around aliens and the crafts they pilot. Over the last few years, I've begun to talk with integralists about these topics, and I've been continually surprised to discover many of them have had their own powerful and evocative experiences with UFOs, ETs, and paranormal realities." And that got me between the eyes. So not that I've had any of that, but I'm interested in that. And I somehow have the same intuition maybe that you did, that this feels like next. This feels like something I want to explore. Yeah. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about what's going on here, Sean?
Great. Well, in college, I tried to triple major. I tried to major in philosophy, psychology, and biology. because I wanted to study animal consciousness. And those were the three main disciplines that you really have to, be plugged into in order to make sense of, what can we say about animal consciousness? So I was trying to be an integralist, way back then, as many of us on this journey have our stories of how we try and bring it all together. And then I discovered Ken's work, and I became just interested in consciousness in general, right? Human consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, including animal consciousness, and focus on integral ecology and the planet, and really love this idea of not just being world-centric, but being planet-centric, right? Where, planet centrism, as Michael Zimmerman and I talk about in integral ecology, is embracing all of humanity plus the biosphere, plus the natural world, right? And finding the right integration and balance between nature and culture. So, I think I've always just loved the mystery of the world, and love information and love integral because it allows me to hold a lot of pieces. And, I got my doctorate in philosophy. And, there's really no other topic like UFOs or extraterrestrials where all the key philosophical issues come alive very quickly. Like what's it mean to be human? Are we alone? Like all the, like these incredible things about what's perception, what are ethic, and so I think there's been a number of things kind of driving my path forward along these lines. So initially, like 15 years ago, when I first started reading Whitney Stryver's book, Communion, with that, evocative, bald, extraterrestrial female on the cover that so many people remark on. And as a side parallel, it's kind of interesting. People say the same thing about Brief History of Everything. Right. That there's something about the cover of those books that just grabs a lot of people, and they don't know why, but they're grabbing it off the shelf and buying it.
So you're talking about the book Communion. Okay,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for naming the title. Yeah, so Communion by Whitney Stryver. So I read that just out of my integral interest in all things, in the world, and in the universe, and like
of all things bald.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's like, yeah. So I read that and it was intense. I was like, wow, this is hardcore. So I plowed through all of Whitney's books, in like a few month period. And that kind of set me on a path of being, exploring this topic. And, I think one of the things that really struck me about reading Whitney Stryver's books is in that process, I learned that after he wrote Communion, he and his wife got around 140,000 letters from people saying, wow, I just read your book, and I have to tell you, I haven't told anyone this, but something very similar happened to me. Now, when 140,000 people write you a letter, along those lines, like that caught my attention. It's like, what is going on? Is this just like mass delusion? Is this like kind of some Jungian archetypal thing? Or how is it that his book would open the floodgates like that? So my interest was piqued, and, I kept reading and exploring. And, then kind of in my path with integral, I've really been exploring, how to integrate the gross, subtle, and causal realms. And I've often been intrigued by the subtle realms and how, in integral, sometimes there's a feeling and others have that integral doesn't fully articulate the subtle realms as much as it could. And as much as...
Scott, let me stop you just for a second, because I have a lot of newbies that watch this and listen. Just give us a little brief explanation of the gross, subtle, and causal realms.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and please feel free to have me stop and fill in bits. So, these are the three major states that Wilber identifies as being, a core element of reality that we have to include if we're going to have an integral map, integral approach. And, the vast majority of contemplative traditions point to these three major states in their teachings and in their practices and so forth. And they also map onto the cycle of, waking consciousness, sleeping, dreaming, and then deep dreamless sleep. But essentially the gross state is, physical body, energy, our five senses, and just kind of what we would generally think of as, everyday consensual reality. The subtle realm and the subtle states are energetic, emotional, kind of psychedelic, where people, shamanic states, vision quests, energies, mental. Yeah. And then causal is timeless and spaceless, no identity, often leads into forms of non-duality, but it's devoid, it's open, it's blank, it's pregnant, it's nameless. And so those are three major.
It's full and empty.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like all these paradoxical ways to try and point to it because it exceeds, it's the Tao that cannot be named.
Right.
And so, Ken's, done a lot to really, articulate the causal and the non-dual, and he makes room for the subtle. But there's been a lot of integral practitioners I've talked with over the years who are drawn to exploring the subtle more and have struggled with like how to do that in the context of integral, because sometimes it feels like integral downplays it and it says, just get through that and get on to the good stuff, the causal and the non-dual, right? Yeah. And that's also in the Buddhist teachings, right? A lot of the traditions are kind of anti-subtle, where they see it as a distraction. It'll take you off the course of enlightenment, and don't go down those rabbit holes, just stay on the straight and narrow, right? So there's kind of this movement of kind of revitalizing and exploring the subtle and, and kind of, doing that in a spiritual way. So that's been part of my path, is working with the subtle realms. And in that space, there's astral travel, there's, shamanic journeying, there's working with archetypal images and energies. There's, working with, like as an ecologist, integral ecologist, also do work with earth energies and like dowsing. And, so there's a lot of ways that you can kind of explore the subtle realm and subtle energies. And in that process, I've had a number of my own experiences that kind of left me a bit speechless and kind of wondering like, all right, what's going on here? Like, this feels like it's, it's extraterrestrial. It's something different than what I'm finding in my Buddhist, work, or in, even my shamanic work, or, so.
So this would be some second person I, thou kind of connection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And not like, a full blown abduction kind of experience, but, in meditations, in, different journeys, different ways of working with mind and awareness, different images, different intuitions, different communications, different kinds of, just data points, right? It's like you don't know what any of this means, right? It's hard to really, put your finger on and say, well, this is what that was. Mm-hmm. But they were experiences that made me realize that we live in a multidimensional world, right? And so I started shifting from kind of my focus on integral as like my word of choice to this word multidimensionality, and just realizing that like there are many more layers. Time and space is much more dynamic than we often realize. And so as I started exploring multidimensionality, and then I started talking with more integralists, I started to discover that a lot of well-known integralists, many of whom many of whom many would know, that are well-known in kind of different integral circles. Basically, as I was kind of coming out and kind of putting myself on the line and saying, hey, I've had some experiences kind of like this, like I don't know what to make of it. They would say, well, I've had an experience very similar to that, or kind of related to that, and here's what it is. Some of them were abduction-like experiences. Some were full I, thou, interacting with different beings, and so there's.
Here's where the distinction of gross and subtle comes in handy, because it's one thing to say that one has an experience in the subtle realm of other intelligences. I don't have any problem with that at all. Right. It's where the claims of the gross come in, where it's like, this is physically happening. I was physically abducted. I was met in physical space, an alien. Sort that out for us.
Yeah. So at this point, the people I've talked with, I don't believe they were claiming a physical encounter. It was a subtle realm encounter.
Okay.
And I think this is one of the misunderstandings. I think many of the abduction experiences that are written about, or documented in case studies, I think a vast majority of them are subtle realm primarily, though there can be physical realm aspects, right? And then that's where we bump into kind of our scientific orientation and
materialism.
Materialism and just, different ontological claims. And this is, again, coming back to my sense of a multidimensional world of like kind of starting with, like you're saying, in the subtle realm, there's all kinds of intelligences. Those sometimes can show up in the form of, a goddess or an archetype or a being or a lost relative. And those experiences might ontologically be some of those things, or they might just be how you're processing those energies and intelligences in ways that make sense for you in that moment, right? So there can be a lot of different ways of interpreting it, understanding it. But so I started, just doing more research. I just was like reading this, reading that, and I read a wide range of stuff, right? Everything from like the hardcore science to like the way far out crazy shit, so really like just taking it all in and using an integral frame to kind of make sense of it. And one of the things that, struck me, two things. One was, as I, read these 300 books, what stood out was the amount of evidence that something pretty profound is going on and the evidence coming from all kinds of different zones, if you will, like integral zones. So integral methodological pluralism, different quadrants, different inside or outside perspectives of those quadrants, that the amount of evidence was just coming in from all corners of the quadratic universe.
Yeah, there's one line you wrote in your letter where you said, it is arguably the most intellectually credible topic with the most cultural taboo surrounding it.
Yeah.
And a phenomena with so many people attesting to it, credible people, and it's simultaneously denied by mainstream consensual reality.
Yeah, and so this is my entry point right there, Jeff, is that paradox, that juxtaposition. Because as a trained philosopher, and as an integralist, I'm drawn to that paradox of like, how could this be so intellectually credible? I mean, there's so many well-respected, upstanding scientists and individuals, intellectuals in our global community who are saying this is a worthy topic. And yet it is like the kiss of death professionally to like even go near it. And so having an integral frame has helped me tune into the shadow of like, okay, how is it that this topic has so much shadow around it, right? Like, why is it so taboo? Like that in itself starts to become evidence that there's something to this.
Yeah. Because
it's so repressed.
Yeah.
Right. It's so taboo.
You don't have shadow without light shining on something.
Yeah. So just following the smoke trail of the shadow, that combined with the intellectual validity of it, combined with how many credible people with nothing but something to lose who have come out and said something or defended some aspect of the phenomena, saying, I had this experience, right? You think of John Mack at Harvard, right? Totally putting his career on the line. He basically got kicked out and then got lawyers to help him, get back in. Right?
Yeah.
And he's just one of hundreds.
Well, humanity moves forward heresy by heresy.
Right. Yeah.
In a way. And this does challenge academia and, basically scientific materialism, which
challenges everything. Like if you think about what happened when Galileo, put out his view of the earth and the sun. If you think about what Darwin did, like those pale in comparison to the upside down world we would find ourselves in. And I believe we'll find ourselves in when some level of affirmation of a UFO or UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, ET reality gets acknowledged on a larger scale.
Yeah.
And if you just take a few, and also we have exoscience exploding, right? So if you think of just these few facts, right? So right now, there are between 100 billion and 200 billion galaxies, right? So let's just say 100 billion. There's 100 billion galaxies. One of those galaxies is ours, the Milky Way. In our Milky Way, there are 100 billion stars, right? So this is just 100 billion stars in one galaxy out of 100 billion galaxies. Of those 100 billion stars, the conservative estimate, conservative now, is that there are 20 billion Earth-like planets. 20 billion in our galaxy, the Milky Way, 20 billion. Now they're Earth-like, not Neptune-like, not Uranus-like, not Mercury or Venus-like, Earth-like, right? So we've just discovered about 3,000 confirmed exoplanets in the last 10 years, with another 3,000 kind of waiting for confirmation. They're called candidates, right? So if you just start with that, right, it's like, holy smokes. Like, how could we be the only intelligent species, or only, even like we're now at the point where there's a case to be made that there's micro life on, Titan, or Europa, the moons around Saturn and Jupiter.
Yeah, it's certainly no stretch, even for a scientific mind, to think that the conditions that Earth had, if replicated, are going to create life in the same way Earth did.
Yeah.
So the question is, why is it so underground, or why haven't they just contacted us? Why haven't they just put up a billboard in the sky, or I don't know what?
Yeah, I knew you would ask that, because this is kind of like where the conversation often goes, and it has different versions. One of it is, why haven't they landed on the White House lawn? Right.
Right. And isn't this, am I thinking right, Fermi's paradox?
Right. Yeah.
The idea that if they're, if you just roll the dice, you're going to get planet after planet. And, if you look at where we've come in 1,000 years, if somebody just gets 1,000 years or 2,000 years head start, imagine 1,000,000 years head start. What the fuck are they up to?
Right. Yeah.
Maybe, my pet theory is that just as we are interfering with, we have a sort of a consciousness now where we don't want to unnecessarily interfere with ecosystems. Even that little island off of India with those prehistoric people, that they don't want to bother us, or they want to leave us be. It would be immoral to interfere. Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a number of key things here. So one is, there's a lot of reasons to believe they have contacted us, that there actually is a deep interaction that's happening, right? And there's a number of reasons why that interaction is kind of obscured for us. One is just this notion of, from Star Trek, the prime directive, right? That, this non-interference rule. So that's one layer. The other is that, if you look at the history of UFO sightings, there's good reason to believe that it goes all the way back to, the beginning. And there's a lot of, different kinds of data points that are suggestive of that. But something seems to have shifted with the nuclear age, that as soon as we develop nuclear weapons, they seem to show up more. And the amount of sightings around nuclear installments and the ways our nuclear arms have been disarmed in ways that are inexplicable, that it was almost as if when we let off the 2 bombs in Japan, that amount of energy release sent signals throughout multiple dimensions, and other modes of intelligence took notice and said, all right, we need to go check out what's going on over there, because they're getting to the point where they can start messing with our reality, and those adolescent Earthlings need to, we need to keep an eye on them. So there seems to be something very interesting around.
I would so love to think so.
Yeah.
That somebody was looking out for us.
Well, the idea is that, the good ones and the bad ones came, right? So that just as with humanity, there's a wide range of species of ETs, and they have all kinds of different agendas, many of which we're not clear on, or it's not very clear what those are. So there's a range of benevolence and, nasty critters, if you will. right? And that kind of makes sense. Like, why would we expect, much different?
Well, actually, to me, it doesn't make sense. And here's why.
Yeah.
If I look at the evolution of consciousness, it is the circle of things and beings worthy of moral consideration just relentlessly continues to grow. So I can't imagine, just using the quadrants, that any life form would become technologically proficient enough to, get off the ground, would not have a consciousness that was benevolent.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, though my sense is that it has happened, and though I totally get like what you're saying. And here's one piece in the literature around the subtle realms. There's this notion that there's these different dimensions, like fourth dimension, fifth dimension, so forth. And different people have different models or maps of how many dimensions there are. A lot of them agree loosely around the following point: that humans, as we understand ourselves now, are primarily in the third dimension, which is a gross realm dimension. And that in the fourth dimension is the kind of a primary subtle realm where good and evil both exist,
right,
in that space.
Right. You're making me think, go keep going.
Yeah. When you get to fifth dimension, that fifth dimension is primarily defined by love. And then it goes up and kind of finer grades of love and light and, oneness and unity, right? So that in the subtle realms, there is this fourth dimension that is polarized. And so there are beings and species on other planets who have gone down a bad technological path and evolved. And I think some of, Ken's own arguments about lines and levels and stuff, could be applied to this, that they're incapable of evolving past a certain point, but they are able to go beyond the third dimension and into the fourth dimension. And what a lot of the UFO phenomena seems to be able to do is move back and forth between the subtle and the gross realm, right? That they materialize and dematerialize, and somehow there's an ability working with time and space to move in and out of those phases, kind of like particle wave dynamics. And so I think this is where your point is true, that on a big meta scale, what you're saying, I think, is accurate. But I think when we look at the data and we look at what people are claiming, and people who seem to be largely credible, that they're painting a more complex cosmology that makes room for how there could be, beings that have interstellar travel technology, but whom don't yet have world-centric or cosmic-centric awareness behind that.
Yeah. Well, I'm that's still going to be a hard one for me to swallow. But it does occur to me that there could be such a group that might be able to do liftoff into this fourth dimension that you're talking about, without having it be in the gross realm at all.
Right.
They just, it's like the Tibetans sitting around in caves, who, soared into the stratosphere spiritually.
Right.
But as Ken often says, technologically, they were yak butter.
Right.
I always love that.
Yeah. And I think you're right that there are certain species for whom that's been the trajectory, where they've evolved into, using subtle realm practices that have enabled a certain kind of cosmic exploration, but that they're not necessarily in nuts and bolts craft.
Okay, so let me catch up just sort of in the felt nature of this. So this fourth dimension, all of a sudden, I'm loosed from Earth. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I find myself in a matrix of subtle dimensions that are not limited to this planet. I mean, I might have a sort of a gravitational pull to this planet. Right. But I can go all over the place, right? And time and space no longer limit. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. And so and this is where, this is one of the streams of evidence that I came across. If you read the near-death experience literature and the out-of-body experience literature and the life between, what's that?
Very convincing.
Yeah, and the life between life work, right? Michael Newton and Linda Backman and so forth. What you find is, in that literature, people who describe through those states and those situations having extraplanetary encounters, right? It's not the majority of experiences. Most of them are more kind of earthbound in nature. But, Robert Monroe in his books, the further you read in his stuff, he starts going to other planets. He starts having encounters with different types of intelligence associated with different planetary systems or just in the subtle realms, right? And then you look at the Indian spiritual traditions. A lot of them talk about how you can go to other planets through astral travel, through meditations, right? And interact with these different intelligences, right? So you find, and then you have the DMT material, right? Where people are using DMT and the work by, Rick Strassman.
You're talking the drug DMT?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is a psychedelic, right?
Yeah. So they are mainlining this DMT and they're popping out and having these really intense, extraterrestrial encounters, right? So, and then shamans often do too. And I've even talked with shamans who basically will acknowledge extraterrestrial realities, but basically say, but that's not my thing. I'm not interested in that. I just ignore them, right? Because I'm focused more on the spirits and the plants or the spirits, and around our local space, right? So you find across all of those inner roads to outer space, right? All those kind of inner technologies, people that are credible reporting their experiences that are describing that they're having otherworldly or off-worldly experiences of one sort or another. And so that becomes a very interesting body of literature and evidence pointing to there's something going on here.
Yeah, it does. And yet I have to say my bullshit alarms go off because I know how people are.
Yeah.
And how we want that. It's the impulse around religion and,
right.
And actually non-scientific things. Right. That science comes in to sort of tease apart what's provable about your claims and what isn't. And, and what science wants to do then is say, okay, what isn't provable, we're just going to explain away.
Right. And this is where I think...
I'm tired of explaining it away. I get that you could explain it away as delusion and projection and all of these things. But I'm interested in, if we don't do that, where are we at? Where we actually take all of this stuff seriously.
Yeah. Here's one of the challenges with this domain. Earlier in our conversation, I talked about how much evidence there is, right? And I've arrived at that through my own process, right? And that's debatable, and we can talk about what that is. At the same time, I'm also aware that there's more non-evidence in the field than anywhere else. So it's you have two big piles of both, right? So you have a big pile of bullshit and you have a big pile of stuff that you really should take a second look at.
Yes.
Right. And so that's what makes it so hard to sort through, right? How do you navigate that? And the other thing is, this is why an integral approach, I think, is quite fascinating when it's pointed at this topic, because any one strand of the evidence, like I just pointed to, basically what I would call the astral travel reports, and it comes from 4 or 5 different types of traditions or modes of travel, whether it's meditation or ayahuasca or out-of-body experience. Right. So that's one strand. And you could just kind of go, oh, yeah, whatever.
Or a mental illness.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But keep going.
When you take an integral methodological pluralist approach and you start looking at the kinds of evidence that come from all the quadrants, from all the zones, and you realize that every one of them basically offers a mountain of evidence, right? So you have experiencers, right? And you can critique the whole issue around hypnosis, right? But there are enough people who have had memory recall who got that not through hypnosis, but just through it, the memories kind of coming back after the trauma of the experience, and that those stories are coherent and they echo much of what's discovered in the hypnotic process. So yes, we can critique the hypnotic, methodology and its limitations and its challenges, right? But so this is the piece around the integral. It's when you start plotting the different sources of evidence, the whistleblowers, the military, corporate, and political whistleblowers, that have come forward in the last 10 years, right? with a lot to lose, and many of them actually have lost a lot as a result of coming forward, who say, I worked for Lockheed Martin, I worked for the government, I worked for this black budget project, right? There are over 500 of those people who've come forward with half-hour to 2-hour testimony describing, and when you listen to them, the level of specificity of what they're describing, and what they're saying, there's a lot of sincerity and it's very believable. Now, of course, we still can critique, witnesses and say, well, right. So, but then when you look at those astronomical facts I just gave about how many, planets there are, how many galaxies, right? You look at the Vatican, the fact that the Vatican has come out with a pro-ET position for the last 10 years, right? And that they're basically saying they're out there and, we're going to start positioning the Catholic faith to be in a mode of receptivity so that if and when there is contact, we can easily do an about face and embrace that reality without it disrupting our religious orientation, right? So they've done a lot of good work around preparing themselves in that sense. And so that in itself is interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it was you who sent me an article out of the New Yorker called Have Aliens Found Us? A Harvard astronomer on the mysterious interstellar object Oumuamua.
Yeah, so this guy is the head of Harvard's astronomy department, and he's digging in and saying the data suggests that this interstellar object was likely a light sail, which basically is like kind of solar powered, alien craft. And he's getting, like John Mack, getting attacked left and right and dismissed. And yet this is like arguably one of the smartest people on the planet.
Yes, exactly. His name's Avi Loeb. He's the chair of Harvard's astronomy department.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Then you look at the Freedom of Information Act, right? And there's literally been over 10,000 documents, classified documents have been released. Many of them came out in the 70s before they kind of shifted the rules and kind of got a little more of a clamp on it. But 10,000 FIOA documents that attest to UFO interest by our different intelligence agencies and the reports and the concerns and the ways they've been dealing with it, right? So it's not a conspiracy theory to say the government's covering something up. What they're covering up is not totally clear. But
do you think there are things that they know that they're not telling us?
The evidence very clearly says yes.
You think they're telling Trump?
Well, and here's the thing. There's been a number of good archival researchers who have gone through all the presidents and basically written books saying which presidents were briefed in, which ones were not, which ones knew something, which ones likely didn't. Presidents are seen as a 4 to 8 year, issue. So not all of them have a need to know. Some of the earlier ones in the 40s and 50s and 60s seem to were more in the know because of certain things that happened. There's also a book that documents over 70 crash retrievals. We often think of Roswell as like the one and only, and maybe there was another one. But there have been almost over 100 documented crash retrievals, and not all of them we're able to confirm. But it just is another data point that's pointing that these are credible witnesses that are claiming that something went down in this part of Texas, something went down in this part of Russia, something went down in this part of Brazil, and the CIA flew in, roped it off and did this and that, right? So we can't always confirm what actually happened, but there is evidence that suggests something happened, and we're not knowing about it, or it's not visible to us as the general public. And a lot of people point out that most of the UFO sightings, and get this, there are 30, on average, 30 credible UFO sightings a day in the US alone that are reported, right? That are not a bird, not a balloon, like that are genuinely unidentified aerial phenomenon that cannot be explained away. So that's a lot, right?
Yeah. Well, the one that haunts me is from my ex, who is one of the most grounded people I know, period. Just he does not go off into fantasy land. And he told me that he and his previous partner were driving on the freeway, and this wasn't subtle.
Yeah.
This was a UFO parked along the side of the road, and there were scores of cars that had pulled over to look at it.
Yeah.
And, and that happened. Now, what I know is that he believes that happened in real life.
Yeah. And Jeff, when you look at how many people have some version of that experience, it's in the millions that have a physical encounter with a craft. And a lot of those crafts leave trace elements. And there's been research done on the burn marks, and they've analyzed the soil, and they've found all kinds of, anomalies, and it's weird. It doesn't make sense. Right. And so again, it's like the evidence shows us that something happened that we can't explain, but what exactly was it? We have the eyewitness testimony. There are tons of multiple witness encounters that are extremely credible. So this isn't just one or two people having an experience. This is like John Mack went to Zimbabwe to interview a group of children who encountered a craft that landed in the playground, and 4 or 5 beings came out and interacted with them. And the children had this whole experience, 60 of them. And then, that's just one example, right? And when you see John Mack interviewing the children, it's powerful. It's like, whoa, what the hell is going on? Right?
All right. So just to juxtapose that, It was not that long ago. I lived in Boulder, so it was in the last 30 years. There was a series of sightings at the Mother Cabrini Shrine up on I-70, which is a Catholic little monastery statue. It's a shrine to the Mother Cabrini. And that the heavens opened and the Virgin Mary appeared. And there was 30,000 people who would go and see the Virgin Mary appear. And then that sort of petered out. And, I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think, until I have some kind of, again, what's juicy and interesting to me, because I don't have to unbelieve anything, is the idea that there are consciousness, that there are beings, actually. I mean, I did an interview with Brian Belitzos. I don't know if you know him.
We've had many UFO ET conversations.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I talked to him about the Urantia book.
Right. Yeah.
And the cosmology, evolutionarily based, I must say, and it appealed to me for that reason.
Yeah.
The cosmology of seraphims and angels and this one and that one, and that there is this whole sort of world that is not, in a way, it is planet-based, but it's, transplanetary.
Yeah.
And communication and movement is possible, and that turns me on.
Yeah. It's a beautiful, powerful vision, the Urantia book. And, when I first kind of started getting into this literature and reading it, I was very drawn to the UFO ET hypothesis, as it's often called. Where I'm at now is that that's just one layer of a much more bizarre set of realities, right? So you were asking about the
Mother Cabrini Shrine.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the book, The Hunt for a Skinwalker, and what happened there in the Utah Basin, and all the money that Bob Bigelow, big, billionaire space guy, put into researching the phenomena that was happening there, that you have these examples of basically what I would call a portal site, right? There's some interdimensional.
You say this is an actual site in Utah that? Yeah.
So there's a ranch there, and there's been a history of paranormal experiences that have involved UFOs, orbs. A lot of it's orbs. A lot of UFOs are not silver disc crafts. A lot of the sightings are orbs, and orbs that seem to be under intelligent control, orbs that split into two, orbs that are dynamic. Some are small, some are big. But so in the Hunt for Skinwalker, they're looking at the UFO sightings, they're looking at the orbs, they're looking at the different mysterious monsters, basically cryptozoology. The house and the ranch had poltergeist activities, literally like shovels disappearing and then reappearing, and like places that were impossible for them how did that happen? So literally like a dematerialization and a rematerialization of these objects, and that happened many times, and they have it all documented, right? Bob Bigelow brought in a scientific team that worked on that ranch nonstop for many years, documenting all
Bob Bigelow is this billionaire who's into this. Okay.
Yeah. And part of the challenge was none of the phenomenon repeated itself under conditions that allowed them to get scientific data. And so this is part of the challenge of why we need a post-positivist model of science to better grapple with the phenomena, because the phenomena is not conducive to our current materialistic methodology of scientific inquiry. And so it's somehow is outside of that box. Even though there's aspects of the phenomena that we study through those boxes, but to get to the real heart of it, it somehow transcends that. And part of the reason why, and this is one of the great things about Jeff Kripal's work with Whitney Stryver in their book, The Supernatural, is the phenomenon appears to be both objective in a very, very objective way, subjective in a very, very subjective way, both subjective and objective at the same time, and neither subjective and objective. So the phenomena somehow is like all four of those possibilities, right? So it makes our notion of particle wave look like, some easy equation. Like it's much more bizarre. And I like to say the truth is stranger than science fiction.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, come on. I mean, even just to start at square one, here we are.
Right.
What the fuck?
Right.
I mean, you take a big mess of hydrogen, leave it alone for 13.8 billion years, and you end up with our conversation.
Here's a funny anecdote that I think makes an important point. When I lived in Africa, I lived in Chad, sub-Sahara desert, super dry, 130 degrees, during certain periods of the year, like horrible hot. And I had this little patch of dirt behind my mud hut. And my mom sent me seeds to plant a garden. And I just thought, yeah, right. As if any of the, but I had a lot of time on my hands. So I was like, all right, I'll plant these. I'll water them. I'll see what happens. I had an amazing garden. Like life wants to happen.
It does.
Right? Like even under horrible conditions, like if you just even look at our planet,
vents, these
exactly.
acidic ocean vents.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point, is that like even under the most non-life conducive environment is able to produce life, right?
Yeah.
Our science is showing us that. So why would we not assume that in all of those, 20 billion Earth-like planets, that there aren't 5, there aren't 10. And even it might not be life as we know it. This is the other thing. A lot of our modeling and assumptions are based on carbon-based, water-based, oxygen-based life forms. But like your point about the, acidic vents in the ocean, like, whether intelligent life could emerge from those conditions, maybe not. But, the fact that different forms of life in very different, radically, harsh conditions could evolve. Like, I think it's a much more dynamic universe than what we often, realize.
Right. Yeah, me too. So, in that kind of a context, none of this is hard to believe.
Right. Yeah. And so then why the taboo? Like, why is it so shadowy? Right. Well, because it deals with sex and deals with mind control, and it deals with government secrecy, and it deals with loss of autonomy, and it deals with a topic that would turn our world upside down. Right. It deals with free energy and what that represents in terms of us moving away from a petrol-based economy, like holy smokes, like, that would rock our world, right? Like if, because one of the main implications of UFOs is that they're not fueled by, the kinds of fuel we use on our planet. Like they seem to be antimatter, anti-gravity, electromagnetic, like they're using different modes of energy that allow them to move silently, to make very quick shifts and so forth. So, just the energy implications. And this is one of the reasons why it's been so secret, right? Is that, if we assume that we've recovered some craft. And there is every good reason to assume that's the case. I mean, when you really look at the evidence, if you just look at the work of Richard Dolan, right, one of the best kind of academic, UFO researchers, he has a 2-volume set. It's about to be 3 volumes that looks at the UFO and national security. And there are the massive tombs where he does the homework. He goes through all the declassified documents. He talks with all the military personnel and political folks. And like the case is very strong that we've come into possession of at least a handful of craft, and we've reverse engineered aspects of that, right? And so a lot of people in the know claim that a majority of the craft that are seen are actually ours, right? So this raises a very interesting point. If that's the case, wow, like why is it our government or the private sector, corporate, black budget folks have some of this technology that could be used for a lot of good, but it's not yet in the public, space.
Mm-hmm.
So it's shadow because it'll totally change almost every part of life and society as we know it. Mm-hmm. There's not a bigger game changer. In fact, one of the things that Richard Dolan says in his book, AD, After Disclosure, like, what's it look like, after, the world kind of comes to grips and, there's some kind of, non-deniable evidence. He basically says it'll be so earth-shattering and transformative for society that there's a chance that we will change our numerical system for dating for the life before disclosure and life after, right? So that we would shift from using, it would no longer be 2020, it would be 1, right? That it would have that level of a radical implication.
It would finally bring the Republicans and Democrats together.
Right. Well, and this is the other thing, Ronald Reagan, and others, political figures, presidents and military folks have often made the case that, that we would, unite in a way that, would be quite different from, our petty wars.
Well, I think if evolution continues, we will. I mean, it's like every stage is inconceivable from the previous stage.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
Yeah.
And we think that's going to stop?
Right.
So there is one thing I wanted to ask you, and that is, and I think you mentioned it in some of the notes you sent me, that we can actually cultivate our receptivity to these intelligences or what's going on, this bigger reality.
Yeah.
And we do it by working with what you call our clairs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Great. Yeah. And this is kind of how I ended up going down this road and it comes back to this idea of multidimensionality, that, my practices in Buddhism and in Diamond Approach and, in some of the other traditions I work in, I kept being drawn to cultivating different forms of senses that reveal the subtle realms, right? And if you just take the 5 senses, there's basically a subtle realm correlate to each of them. So for vision, it's clairvoyance, right? The ability to see. For hearing, it's called clairaudience, the ability to hear, right? Clairsentience is the ability to feel and sense, right? So one of the main things, and Dean Radin has done a lot of work around this, the chief scientist at Institute of Noetic Science, and he's written a lot on the evidence around psi, and the yoga traditions talk about the cities, which is the same thing, right? So there's a lot of, most of the contemplative traditions talk about the cities and these capacities. Many of them, as I mentioned before, will say, don't get distracted by that, just focus on awakening, getting off the wheel of karma, But if you pause and really work with those practices and exercises that begin to open up those subtle senses, it's basically, if you think of our material world is based on the 5 senses and what we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, right? And that's reality. Well, and all of us have that, right? But not all of us have cultivated our 5 subtle senses. And there's actually a few more than 5, but if we just use that as like an analogy, that to perceive, experience, and interact with these phenomenon, these realities, be they, energies, be they intelligences, be they UFOs, be they certain kinds of gods and goddesses and archetypes. And, going to, in Tibetan Buddhism, you learn to go to the Pure Lands, and to go to different bodhisattva realms, right? Yeah. And lucid dreaming through astral travel, where you actually get teachings, right? And in the Western context, it often gets played down as kind of a dream state. But if you really read the literature and those traditions, they're saying these are ontological realms that you go to in your subtle body, yep. and you receive different, teachings, and then yep. bring that back into this plane, yep. right? So there's a lot of ways of developing multidimensional awareness. And there's actually this great book by Kurt Leland. I think it's called The Multidimensional Human. And he uses the 4 quadrants. He doesn't know about Wilbur, but they're the same 4 quadrants. And he identifies a series of 5 or 6 exercises to do in each quadrant to develop subtle sensory awareness in that realm, right? So, first person, second person, third person, right? So there's a lot of resources out there for people who want to cultivate their path, in this way. And the last thing I'll say about this, Jeff, and then see if there's, follow-up or other questions to explore, is one thing that really surprised me as I started exploring this literature is how many of the people who are, good at these practices, how much they talk about the causal realm and non-duality. And that, because it was almost as if I just assumed that the non-dual talk was really only going to be found in the Buddhist traditions and the Asian traditions and and yet to find in our own kind of even, Western esoteric tradition, a very rich non-dual and causal mapping of phenomenon and awareness that if you go deeper into developing these clairs, it leads you to unity, it leads you to non-duality, it leads you to an awakened awareness. And this was very earth-shattering for me because so many of the other traditions basically say, don't go down that path because it's a distraction. But then as I went into them and discovered, well, that might be true in some cases, and I can appreciate the caution, but many of the people who are actually practicing in those traditions, they're on the non-dual train, right? Mm-hmm. And they're getting there through opening up their subtle senses. Mm-hmm. That's part of the integrated human being that they're helping to create a new template for.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's that same kind of thing that is keeping humanity from really turning and facing this squarely, is that in a sense, we're not ready. It's too distracting. Yeah. There's a stage in which that's true.
Yeah.
You don't want to play with this stuff until you're ready. And a lot of practices make us ready.
Yeah, and this is one of the other points that's made around contact, that as a human species, we're not yet a galactic species. We're not yet a multi-planet.
We're not even planet-centric.
Yeah, but that we're now pushing into space. We're going to have a base on Mars and on the moon in the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to think we're going to have, something along those lines in place. So it's hopefully it can be a catalyst and force us to develop the world-centric orientation that we need at a bigger global level, because many of the people report that part of why contact hasn't occurred on a bigger, more explicit level is because we're basically killing each other on this planet, and that the benevolent beings that are out there that are ahead of us in this journey basically can't interact with us until we get our shit together. And that we have to, get to another level collectively before we can kind of enter into a galactic conversation with the intelligent races who have been there for thousands, plus years, right? So it's an interesting consideration.
Yeah. Think we'll get there?
I do. I'm optimistic. But one thing that I've noticed, is fragmentation and integration seem to go together. I used to believe that we were headed to an integral omega point, and at some point we would outrun the fragmentation. We would outrun the xenophobia. We would outrun the tribalism. I think that's possible, but what I'm noticing is that they increase together, right? And you see this with the Trump administration, right? In the sense that Trump is, arguably sexist, racist, and all these things. And yet you have the Me Too movement, right? Where you have, more people coming forward and describing their experiences and key men being taken down, right? So there's this weird cosmic balancing act where it's like, we couldn't have had the Me Too movement without Trump's craziness, right? And so there's some weird thing going on around kind of this kind of large polarity dynamic.
Yeah. Well, evolution is, beautiful, but not pretty.
Yeah, it's messy.
Since day one.
Yeah.
And that ain't changed. It's not changed yet.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it goes. But, I guess I'd say, is there anything else, any other piece you want to put on the table that you think would round this out?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, there's a lot more to say. I mean, obviously the course that I'm doing in September is, 3 months of this kind of open-ended inquiry.
Right.
And,
I wanted to mention that again, and that's the Exo Studies Master's Course. Yeah. And it starts in September. And, tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, I realized, like you said in the beginning, this is a course I've wanted to teach for a long time. And part of it is because I think it calls our best integral selves forward. It calls, the philosopher in me forward. It's like, we get to grapple with some of the biggest, most important topics and issues on the planet. And so I'm a big reader. And so I've read all this content, and I wanted to find a vehicle to kind of give people the dummy's guide, right? To all of this, pull out what I think to be the best books in these 15 categories that I've identified. And part of the reason why I focus on exo studies is because I feel like we need to move a little bit away from the UFO ET framing. Even though I'm engaged by that framing, it's provocative, I think there's a lot of evidence for it. As I mentioned earlier, I think the phenomenon that are showing up in relationship to this is bigger and more mysterious than even that framing, right? And so exo studies is kind of a differentiation from the UFO ET frame, and basically says we need to back up. We need to create a meta science, a meta field that is able to look at lots of different kinds of data from a lot of different places, and then try and understand the patterns. And so we're going to be moving through, 3 main areas in the course. The first 5 weeks is focused on multidimensional awareness, right? And what do people report? First-person reports of these phenomena, these experiences, both the terrifying and the transcendent. And then we spend 5 weeks kind of looking at the issue of, the social taboo and cultural dynamics. So I'm basically I, we, it, right? You can see that pattern, right? So 5 weeks kind of exploring the cultural aspects. And then 5 weeks looking at more of the science, the exo on planet studies, the astrobiology, the number of sightings that have occurred, the physical evidence, the photographic and video evidence that's, pretty strong. Right. And so, and at the end, we have a final week that's really looking at what does it mean to be a multi-planet species? This is where we're headed, whether we're there in 20 years or 100 years, we're headed that direction. So let's start to envision together, what does that mean? How can we participate in that in some way that, supports our own integral unfoldment? So it's going to be a wild ride. There are 36 books I've identified, 2 for each week. People are not expected to read those books. I have. They can pick and choose which ones they want to explore. But I'm going to be a guide saying, these are the books I've read. This is what stands out to me. Here are the key issues as I understand it. Let's talk about it. Here are the best movies. Here are the best documentaries. Here's the best songs, right? So it's going to be a real kind of, guide through the cultural, scientific, philosophical, psychological, existential terrain of what does it mean to consider that we're not alone. Wow.
Well, fantastic. And you're really moving the ball. I mean, talk about integral. Jesus.
Yeah, right.
Your thing together. And I feel like in a new way.
Yeah.
Including, your deep experience with the esoteric traditions and your philosophy. And I mean, wow, Sean, I think this is a worthy challenge for you. And I'm so happy that you're taking it up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and a big part of it has just been, as I mentioned, the conversations with other integralists who have said, yeah, let me tell you a story. And that made me realize, like, wow, this is much more pervasive than I realized. Because many of these people are dear friends of mine who I've known for 20 years and never would have guessed, right? And so here we are in our isolated bubbles, helping to, bring integral to the world, and we never had that conversation. And that just highlights the taboo nature, right? And so that's part of what I want to explore. It's like, why is it so shadowy? Right. Like, how can we do collective shadow work around this topic so we can help differentiate the big pile of BS and the big pile of evidence?
Absolutely.
And have a better sense of which is which.
Yes. Well, fantastic. Yeah. We all come out of the closet.
Yeah. That's awesome.
All right, Sean, Esbjorn-Hargens. So good to connect with you again, my old friend.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, really good to dive into this. And thanks for just your curiosity, and inviting me on, because, I think that's what I'm wanting to cultivate. It's just an open curiosity, and, let's just consider what might be and what's possible. So I really appreciate you kind of helping me kick off this new phase of my intellectual, exploration in a way that's very aligned with how I want to be in this process.
I'm honored to do it. Yeah, I'm very turned on and very curious, and I can't wait to see how it goes.
Yeah, great.
And may the benevolent beings bless you and bless all of us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next time.
All right. Bye now.